A well-regulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you so much for tuning in to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam & Company. My name is Cam Edwards. It is great to have you aboard on this edition of the program. Coming up on the show today, we've got Maj Toure from Black Guns Matter in Philadelphia. He was just about a block or so away from where this shootout and standoff occurred the other night. And he's got quite a bit to say about it. Also, we'll talk with Dave Kopel, Research Director at the Independence Institute out in Colorado, about the upcoming Supreme Court case dealing with a New York City gun law and the attempts now to get the court to drop this case, to moot this case. New York City has tried to change the law. New York State's tried to change the law. And now you got 5 Democrat senators who are telling the court, in essence, that's a nice SCOTUS you got. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it. Saying that if the Supreme Court takes this case, if they rule in favor of the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, that it will just demonstrate that the court is politically biased and that the court needs to be, quote, restructured, which means adding more anti-gun justices to the makeup of the court. But I do want to get to a couple of headlines before we get to our interviews today, starting with President Donald Trump last night in Manchester, New Hampshire, at a campaign rally, bringing up mental health, not bringing up gun control at all, as a matter of fact. No red flag mentions, no mentions of expanded background checks. Instead, he talked about reopening mental health institutions that have been shuttered over the last few decades. And I think frankly, I think it's great that President Trump is talking about mental health instead of gun control. At Bearing Arms, I do note that I think we need to be talking more. We need to be talking about more than just reopening these institutions, because the mental health crisis that we're in this country, and we are in a mental health crisis right now. Suicide rates are the highest that they've been since World War II. They're not nearly as high as they were during the Great Depression and World War II, but they're the highest that they've been in more than 50 years. Most of those mental health issues are not going to appear as active assailant attacks, right? We know this. Those are incredibly rare events. Far more common, unfortunately, is suicide, people who are taking their own lives. And some of those individuals may need that acute care that they can only get in an institutional setting. Many people won't. And frankly, we need to be reaching a lot of those folks before it gets to the point that they need that acute care. In many parts of the area, many parts of the country, it is very difficult to find those mental health resources. I'm in Farmville, Virginia, about 3 hours south of Washington, D.C. Yes, Farmville is a real place. I had somebody ask me that today. Yes, Farmville is a real town. It's not just a game on Facebook. And I can tell you, even, on the East Coast, about an hour from Richmond, about an hour from Charlottesville, 3 hours south of D.C., you're probably going to have to drive an hour or more to try to find those mental health resources. We have a few therapists here. We do have a local hospital, but it's really, really difficult to find that mental health or even mental wellness treatment that so many folks need access to. So at Bearing Arms, I talk about the opportunities maybe to perhaps use telemedicine to reach individuals who right now are in areas where those mental health services are not available to them. That might be a very cost-effective measure, and it very well could be a life-saving measure as well. For a different take, we have Beto O'Rourke, who had his campaign reset yesterday in El Paso, Texas. He used that as an opportunity to demand a ban on semi-automatic firearms, also a mandatory, quote-unquote, buyback. Yeah, you think Eric Swalwell feels a little sad that he dropped out of the race and now Beto just took his big idea and bloop, dropped it right in his campaign? Because he was the first one, Swalwell was, to call for a ban and a buyback. Now, you can't buy back something that you never sold in the first place, so it's not a buyback. It's a compensated confiscation program. But Beto doesn't want to call it confiscation, even though that's exactly what it is. And it was interesting. I noted that there was a reporter who talked with Beto O'Rourke after this event, and he said, quote, about the calling for a ban and a compensated confiscation program. He said, "I know that it's not politically easy." He says, "It's frankly why far too few people have proposed it. It's frankly why I have not proposed it in the past." Bull, Beto, bull. It's very politically easy to propose something like this, particularly if you're a Democrat. Vast majority of Democrats support a quote-unquote assault weapons ban. That's not politically difficult. That's not why people don't propose this. I think the reason why people don't propose this is because they don't know how to enforce it, which, by the way, Beto O'Rourke was not asked about yesterday. So we spoke with Larry Keene on yesterday's Bearing Arms Cam and Company. He noted that there are 16 million or so AR-15s legally owned in this country, more common than Ford F-150s. If you were to add in all of the various shotguns and other long rifles that Beto would include in his quote-unquote assault weapons ban, I think it's fair to say you'd be looking at close to 20 million firearms, maybe more, owned by millions and millions of Americans. So what do you do if millions and millions of Americans decide, no, I'm going to keep my gun? I'm not going to turn it in. This is commonly owned for lawful purposes. I believe it's protected by the Constitution. There are going to be court challenges here. I'm going to possess my firearm during those court challenges. I'm not going to use it in the commission of a violent crime, but I'm going to continue to possess this gun that I legally purchased. What do you do with those folks? Let's say 3 million Americans decide that they're not going to turn in their firearms. What happens? I'm sure Beto O'Rourke, first of all, there is no federal gun registry in this country. So even if Beto O'Rourke said, well, we're going to go door to door, how do you know who owns these firearms to go door to door? So no, you're not. But what are you going to do? Are you going to try to prosecute individuals if they use one of these firearms in the commission of a crime? I mean, you could already do that right now. What are you going to do to ensure compliance? And what is the penalty for not complying with this law? You know, again, right now, we have less than 30,000 inmates in federal prisons across the country who are there on weapons charges. Less than 30,000. We have 100 million legal gun owners in this country. Again, let's say 3% of them say, nah, I'm going to keep my semi-automatic rifle. What do you do with the 3 million people who are in violation of that federal law? You going to build enough prison spaces at the federal level to house 3 million Americans? I don't think so. You going to fine them instead of put them behind bars? I mean, I guess you could try. But again, I don't think you're going to be too successful with that. This is, it is a soundbite solution. It is not a real solution to the issue of active assailant attacks. And when Beto O'Rourke says it's time to get serious about this, well, we're waiting, Beto. We are still waiting because this is a very unserious suggestion. And listen, I don't expect that this is going to happen, but Beto, if you're out there watching, or maybe one of your staffers gets word of this, come on Bearing Arms Cam and Company. I won't bite. I won't call you any names. What we will do is we'll have a very serious discussion about your proposal. And you will be asked questions that the mainstream media won't ask you about how your policies would work. I understand you don't think that I or any of my fellow Americans should be able to own AR-15s. I'm not even going to try to debate you on that point because we're just going to have to agree to disagree. But I do want to know how you think your policies would work once they go from being a bill to being a law. And if you can't answer that, then again, this isn't a serious proposal to begin with. We've had a lot of unserious proposals, unfortunately, coming out of Philadelphia as well in the wake of this shootout and standoff that left 6 police officers injured and a suspect in custody. Maj Toure from Black Guns Matter is running for the city council in Philadelphia, the only pro-gun candidate that I'm aware of that's on the ballot there. He joined me earlier today to talk about this violent incident in Philadelphia, the calls for gun control during and immediately after this incident, and what he thinks can and should be done to address the rising violence there in the city of brotherly love. Maj, it's good talking with you today, man. Thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Cam. I ain't talked to you in a minute. I miss your voice, my brother.
Well, listen, I'm glad we're talking again. I got to tell you, I was shocked to see your tweet where you said that you'd had no media outreach to you after this shootout and standoff in Philadelphia, because I thought about reaching out that night and I figured, man, his phone's going to be blowing up. There's no way he's going to be able to get back to me. You had no local media reach out to you to get your take on what went down in Philadelphia the other night.
Yeah, absolutely none. I mean, and since then, you know, after you, a few people have, but I didn't mean that because I want to be clear about this. Sometimes tweets get taken out of context a bit. I didn't mean that to, you know, the guys that I've been on their shows before and things of that nature. But as far as local media, You have a guy that's running for city council, the only pro-gun Second Amendment guy on city council, right? The guy that's having actual connection to the community. This thing happens. That's up the street from my house, literally a block over. This thing happens, and nobody decides to hit me up. And it's like it spoke more to how more left-leaning media, no different than when I was running for, trying to get on the ballot for city council. They deliberately kept me off of media platforms as far as locally. And it speaks to something. It speaks to, are we actually trying to find answers to the scenario, or do we only want to talk about things that are in alignment with, perfectly in alignment with our narrative? And a lot of media, in Philly, which is traditionally a blue city for the most part for some decades now, the media is a spin of that. And it's really kind of a jarring statement to the concept of journalism. And are we telling the truth? Are we trying to get people who have boots on the ground? I was there, and so it's like, okay, if I can get there and if media can get there, they're aware of what we're doing. And it is surprising on one level, on when you think of it from the perspective of media being biased and yellow journalism, it isn't surprising at all.
Absolutely. So I want to get your take on this because, certainly as this event was unfolding, at the national level, you had Democratic presidential candidates who were out there saying, obviously, look, this proves the need for gun control. The mayor late that evening said we got to do something about the gun laws. There's been no shortage of politicians there in Philadelphia who have used this as an opportunity to demand changes to our gun laws. What's your response?
My response is, with all due respect, our governor just magically happened, Tom Wolf just magically happened to have very draconian gun confiscation things that he's calling gun control laws already drafted up, already written, and he decided he's going to sign that in as an executive action. So that's one. Our governor is wrong. Mr. Kinney, our mayor, with all due respect, he's wrong here. This is the same mayor that when he got ruled that, you don't have to follow federal guidelines in regards to immigration laws, he danced in the office. This is the same mayor. So now you're asking for that same federal government that you outright denied. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of more government at all, in any way, shape, or form. But you asked for it to be left alone and not follow the rules there. But now you're asking the federal government to come help you violate Pennsylvania state constitution in essence. Article 1, Section 21 is very clear of the Pennsylvania state constitution. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be questioned, literally. So now you're asking the federal government to intervene in the space where you thumbed your nose up at the federal government for one thing. He's wrong. He's wrong. The guy that did this, and a bigger conversation could be had about the war on drugs, the horrible, horrible, horrible waste of time and money and resources that the war on drugs has been. So on a deeper level, we could have that conversation, but that's a different conversation for a different time. But at the same time, you're talking about a guy that by all intents and purposes was not supposed to have a firearm. He had one. Okay? We're not talking about rehabbing this guy or these types of guys. We're not talking about the war on drugs. We're not talking about that. We're talking about asking more of the same guy who's the felon for drugs and guns, right? Even though, freedom is freedom. You're asking for more rules and you want the federal government to intervene. And it's several layers of contradictions there. So, again, with all due respect, I have no attack on these gentlemen personally. But this policy that they're trying to repeat is wrong. It does not work. There will not be one new magical law that would have stopped this guy from doing what he did. That's just what it is. And on top of that, so now, again, that's my neighborhood. So now on top of that, you're saying, hey, let's create more restrictive policies so people like Maj can't protect himself and his community from people like that guy. That's in essence what he's doing. All at the same time, asking the same federal government, Mr. Anti-Trump, right? You're asking that same federal government to come help you after the fact. Again, wrong on so many different levels.
Absolutely. And you're right that the war on drugs is a different topic, but it is kind of surprising to me that none of these politicians, well, maybe it shouldn't surprise me, but none of these politicians want to acknowledge that this guy, again, 6 times convicted, had no problem obtaining illegal drugs and guns. So if you're going to tell me, that the war on drugs is a failure, as a lot of these politicians in Philadelphia have said, tell me how a war on guns is going to be any different. how it's not going to impact, as you say, the good people in a bad neighborhood and leave those criminals untouched.
Right. And see, that's the biggest contradiction. Albert Einstein said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different result. The drugs were illegal. The guns that he had were unlawful. Okay? The drugs were unlawful. The guns were unlawful. You know, and last I checked, shooting at police officers was unlawful. Last I checked, holding up in a house for hours at a time to shoot somebody and go back and forth was unlawful. There is no magic rule for this. What the actual answer is, and this is the reason why local media has not reached out to me for the most part. The reason why is because they have to acknowledge that that approach has been wrong. They have to acknowledge that the data that, you know, John Lott, who, by the way, just was like blocked from Twitter like yesterday for whatever reason, the work that John Lott has put down in regards to his book, More Guns, Less Crime, the war on guns. The reality is we have the data. 1991, gun-free zones come into existence. Since then, over 90% of mass shootings are in gun-free zones. The data is there. They do not work. So you have to take a different approach. Okay, what does work? In areas where there's a general culture of responsible firearms ownership, safe and responsible firearms ownership, conflict resolution, de-escalation, political education. These are the things that we do at Black Guns Matter. These classes all around the country for the last few years now. You have to acknowledge that when we started doing our work in 2015 to 2016, mostly in Philadelphia, the violent crime rate for 2016 was the lowest it had been since 1979. That's not me making it up. Those are Philadelphia statistics, because we put a concentrated effort on conflict resolution. So they can't reach out to me, in essence, unless they want an actual solution. But to say, you know, again, Mayor Kenny, oh, we need help from the federal government to get these guns off the street. Well, you had an opportunity to have that guy that did this shooting where 6 law enforcement officers were shot, wounded, fortunately not dead, right? You had an opportunity to do something when we could have rehabbed that gentleman or kept him in jail until he was rehabbed. But yet and still, we're going to blame every other organization, every other political faction we with. It is a farce. It's not real. So, in essence, when they want to reach out for actual solutions, the answer is very clear. The answer here is creating a general culture of a respect for the firearms culture, a respect for the rights that we have, as well as the responsibilities that come along with those rights. Getting young people involved in the shooting sports from a very early age so they understand the pros and cons of firearms ownership. Getting young people involved in, you know, you are responsible for your life and your family members and things of that nature. We're talking about the heart, the mind, and culture that ties into a scientific, you know, scalable experiment. That, I mean, in essence, every state that has much more respect for the Second Amendment has notoriously lower violent crimes. They can't have me on there saying that because I'm from the actual demographic, so they can't say, if Cam says it, oh, Cam's just the racist guy. Cam's the white racist guy. Never mind his children. Never mind that. They can't, you know, they'll spin it that way, you know. And so these are very, very, they're exposing their hand tremendously with these types of moves. And I love it, though, because every time they make this type of move, more and more Philadelphians are saying, you know what, I like what that guy Maj is talking about. I think I'm going to vote for him for city council. We need more Second Amendment people involved in local politics. That's why I'm running. On November the 5th, that's why I'm going to take that seat. We need freedom and liberty for urban America, because if not, our elected public servants, like Mayor Kenny, like Governor Tom Wolf, are going to continue to try to push this legislation. And even if they mean well, even if they do, I don't think they mean to be evil and, you know, villains and things of that nature. They're trying things, but those things don't work. We need somebody in positions that knows what works and what doesn't, and is not afraid to buck against traditional theory. Tradition can be wrong as well. At a certain point, you know, people were like, hey, man, we shouldn't have slaves. You know what I'm saying? I don't think we want this anymore. And traditionally, for hundreds of years, it was the opposite. So freedom is always the answer. More legislation and more big government is not the answer in this regard.
Well, unfortunately, you know, when lawmakers hear people say you got to do something, they say, well, I got to make a law. That's what I do. I'm a lawmaker, right? And what you're talking about doing with Black Guns Matter and what you've been able to do with Black Guns Matter is, as you say, you're out there changing the culture. This is beyond government. It's right. Deeper. It's more fundamental than any piece of legislation could ever touch. And I think that you're
Right.
absolutely right, because unfortunately, what you find in a lot of these high crime neighborhoods is that there is no culture of lawful gun ownership. There's no opportunity to really
Correct.
learn and inculcate people into a culture of responsible gun ownership. And when you couple that
Right.
with the fact that, even in the worst neighborhoods in terms of the crime rate, there are far more good people than bad people. We know who those bad actors are. The people living in those neighborhoods know who the bad guys are. The cops know who those bad guys are. Targeted enforcement for those relatively few individuals, right? And you say, listen, you got a choice. You're going to stop shooting one way or the other. We'll lock you up. We'll throw away the key. We'll charge you with everything we can. No plea bargains. Or you can take door number 2 here, and we will help you become a productive member of society if that's what you
Correct.
choose. But one way or the other, the shooting's going to stop. If you were to couple that with the programs that you're doing with Black Guns Matter, Maj, again, I know I'm living in rural Virginia, but I've studied these issues. You want to talk about a transformation? It's possible, but it's not going to happen, as you say, by putting more gun laws on the books. You got to go deeper than that. You got to deal with the individuals who are actually driving the violence, and again, work on creating that culture of responsible gun ownership so that the good people in bad neighborhoods can protect themselves.
Correct. What we have as a conversation here of our political servants have become very lazy and complacent. In the Bible it says faith without works is dead. And they're saying things that are faith-based, and we'll just put another da-da-da-da. There's no work behind that. That's just something you can say in front of a television screen, as opposed to going. I know. Listen, some of these dudes, some of these bad guys that I know, that I grew up with. If I sit down and have a conversation with them, what they feel like, whether they're right or not, is they feel like there's a lack of opportunity for them. And I say to them, listen, if you could stop trapping this way, if there was an option for you, would you prefer it? 95% of those guys, 99% of those guys, man, I just don't feel like nobody's ever. And what happens is, I'll give you a perfect example. Right at the shooting, okay, it's up the street from my house. I can't get to my block, so okay, let's get the cameras out. Let's talk to the people. Let's talk to the actual community members. Let's deal with the fact that you live up the street, and for 10, 7, 8, 6, however many hours, you can't go into your home. Let's talk about that. Let's deal with the community. And what happened was political, guys went and spoke to law enforcement that were shot, and rightfully so. But it has to be a two-pronged approach. The community is affected by this, and just because you think that this bad guy did the wrong thing, for sure, hamstringing more American citizens is not the answer. And when you ask them that, when you ask these guys, you say, so do you want an option? Because it's actually 3 doors. Door number 1 is the one that you said. Okay, again, the shooting is going to stop, especially under my watch, because I'm not one of these dudes that, just pro-gun, and those guys had a rough time in the neighborhood. I don't care if you had a rough time in the neighborhood. Now the rubber meets the road. Door number 1. You continue doing this, we're going to lock you. I want to lock you under the jail. I'm not one of those people that's like soft on crime because you grew up without a dad. I don't care. You're an adult now. Okay. Do you want to get locked up? I want a mandatory minimum for you. You shoot somebody in the commission of any other crime, or just shoot somebody, rob, whatever. I want you locked under the jail twice. You shouldn't even hire a lawyer. You can, but I want to lock you all the way up. And I want to rehab you while you're locked up. And I want to get some labor out of you while you're locked up. I want you to pay your debt to society. I'm very clear on that. The second part is, hey, come do some of these classes if you happen to be in jail. We'll help you. We'll help you rehab. But if not, do you want a different option? Can you change your life around? If we can get some government behind something like that, we want to rehab 1,000 men in Philadelphia. We have the resources to do it, by the way. Okay, that's the second option. Or the third option is, and I'm going to help this one too, I'm going to arm 1 million more people in urban America with firearms, and when you do these types of things, they are going to shoot you. I don't want those 6 law enforcement officers, even though there's not the best police community relations in urban America, I want those 6 men I want those 6 officers to be able, I don't want them to, they may have not made it home tonight. That's it. That's just their job. But I still want those guys to go home. But what I'm going to do is, we want at least 1 million urban Americans to have firearms, rifles, handguns. No different than that guy tried to go into that federal building down in Texas, and citizens lit him up, as well as law enforcement, and that's rightfully so. So that's door number 3. You don't take some rehabilitation. You don't get more responsible about the rights and things of that nature. Number 3 is more armed citizens that are understanding their life, liberty, and their pursuit of property. They have the firearm, so when you do something like that, they are well within their right to lay you down because you are a threat to society. And I'm fine with bad apples being thrown out the bunch. I don't care what happens to a bad apple if that bad apple is not open to being rehabilitated. I live in a community. We're not cool with the killers just because they're right there. So, tying that back into, Mayor Kenney and Governor Wolf adding more restrictions, it does not make sense. Pennsylvania is a free state. Pennsylvania is a free state by and large, and we're going to keep it that way. These guys have those 3 options. Get locked all the way under the jail, and I'm going to laugh the entire time that you're there until you make something better of yourself. B, make something better of yourself now, because you have these opportunities, we have these organizations, and when I'm in city council, I will make sure that there's resources available to this type of work, whether it's Black Guns Matter or not, as well as, number 3, you're going to keep playing like a fool, you're going to play dumb games, you're going to get a real stupid prize, and one of these armed, patriotic Philadelphians, or New Yorkers, or Chicagoans, or Detroit folks are going to light you up one of those law enforcement officers are going to light you up, and we're going to celebrate regardless. That freedom has to be protected. Those people doing those things give anti-gun, anti-freedom people room to move and let that cancer foster, that conversation about more restrictions on our rights. So I'm fine. One of those 3 doors are the options for those types of guys. And we have to, as a community, as Americans, we have to make sure that we're taking that stand, period. And that's how we're going to get through this.
Maj Toure, it's been too long, man, but I'm glad we got a chance to catch up today. And I want to have you back again very soon because the conversation today is getting a little long, but I got so many more questions for you. So will you come back in the next few days? Can we continue this discussion?
Absolutely, Cam. And for anybody listening, if you want to support the work, GoFundMe.com/Black Guns Matter. We need all hands on deck. But yes, absolutely, Cam, for sure.
All right. Thanks, Maj. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Peace.
So just up the road from Philadelphia, you got New York City. And coming up here in about 6 weeks or so, the Supreme Court's going to have a conference in which they discuss whether or not to continue to hear a challenge to a New York City gun law. This law that has been on the books for decades basically says if you're a legally eligible pistol owner in New York City, you've got your pistol license, your premises license, that you can only take your legally owned pistol out of your home if you're going to one of 5 pre-approved ranges there in New York City. You can't take your legally owned pistol down to Virginia to go hang out with me and go shooting. Can't go to a shooting competition in upstate New York. You can't. You literally cannot do that. And the city of New York has defended this law for the entirety that it's been on the books, including at the trial court level, at the appellate court level. Now that the case has gone up to the Supreme Court, gun control advocates are freaking out. They are so worried about a ruling that could impact not only this New York City gun law, but could have implications for other gun control laws around the country, that New York City has actually changed the regulations. New York State stepped in and said, well, we're gonna change the law as well, so New York City can't do what they're doing. The plaintiffs in this case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, say that even with these changes, there are still constitutional issues. Not all of their complaints have been addressed, but you've got gun control groups that are now weighing in, urging the court to drop this case because of mootness, because there's no longer any legal reason to challenge this law because the law has changed. And 5 Democratic senators, including Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, signing on to an amicus brief warning the court, listen, if you hear this case, and if you rule in favor of the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, it's just going to prove how politically poisoned the court is, and we're going to need to restructure the court and put more anti-gun judges on. Dave Kopel, research director at the Independence Institute, says he has never seen a brief like this.
This is the most insulting brief I've ever seen submitted to the court. I mean, in terms of insulting the court itself at great length. Maybe some guy who was a pro se, prisoner, and wrote a more insulting brief. But in terms of someone filed by serious people, this is way off the charts. Never seen anything that comes close to it. But I'd say that there's a method to their madness in 2 senses. First of all, they remember what happened with Obamacare, where as we now know fairly well, after the oral argument, there was a 5-4 majority to strike down Obamacare on the whole, because the individual mandate was agreed to be unconstitutional by a majority of justices, and it was also agreed that, as the statute itself had said, and the Department of Justice had agreed to the court that without the individual mandate, the whole system falls apart. But Patrick Leahy made a famous speech while the case was after oral argument, but before the decision was announced, where he basically warned Chief Justice Roberts that you'll lose legitimacy if you rule against Obamacare, and will portray it as a political decision. And that got him to waffle back enough that we got the result that we did, which still struck down the individual mandate, struck down the mandate that states drastically expand their Medicaid programs, but left the rest of Obamacare intact. So I think that this is really, to the extent that they're trying to influence the case, that this is aimed at Chief Justice Roberts only, even though sort of the tone of it will doubtlessly annoy Justice Ginsburg and all 9 of the justices. Mm-hmm. That's the he's the target for the brief. But then the second thing is, it's also a brief in a broader public opinion sense, which consolidates for public consumption the campaign to delegitimize the Supreme Court, and say that a court that doesn't rule the way that the Democratic left wants is by definition illegitimate.
Now, it's important to note as well that even if the Supreme Court were to probably not heed the warning by senators, but to rule that, okay, this case is largely moot, we're going to send it down to the trial court, or we're going to dismiss it entirely, that's not going to stop Second Amendment challenges. There are other cases out there, including one that the Supreme Court's been holding on to and could decide it wants to hear at any time, called Rogers versus Grewal, which is dealing with the right to carry, or the lack thereof, in the state of New Jersey. And as Dave Kopel points out, there are plenty of other cases for the court to choose from as well.
They could do that, and there's other pending cases too. I mean, particularly, and even stronger in a way than Rogers versus Grewal is. They will have to make a decision about how meaningful the right to bear arms is, mm-hmm. Without even having to change the law, and that would be a big thing. They've also got Pena versus Iran, which is California's ban on all new semi-automatic handguns introduced in 2013 or thereafter.
After the microstamping provision went into effect.
And the requirement for double microstamping, which is impossible.
Yeah.
They could do that one and just say, hey, this is an easy case. We're against handgun bans. That's what Heller said, and banning all new handguns, or all new semi-automatic handguns, which are the vast majority, that definitely counts as a handgun ban.
All right, we've got an armed citizen story for you in just a minute. We've got our good deed of the day, but I've got to get to this story out of Los Angeles, California. Again, when we talk about addressing the issues, fully enforcing the laws that are on the books rather than putting more gun control laws on the books, this is what we're talking about here. KTLA reporting a convicted felon with 7 prior strikes. California has a 3 strikes and you're outlaw. 7 prior strikes. Got a 3-year prison sentence yesterday for a sucker punch that left a man permanently disabled against the urging of prosecutors who wanted this guy to go away for 33 years. And instead, he gets 3. 3. That's it. This is, again, this is unbelievable. But it's not unbelievable. It's California, unfortunately. Christian Isidore DuBose knocked the 34-year-old victim unconscious with a single unprovoked punch to the head, then fled the scene while both men were at a birthday party back on April 13th of 2018. Victim suffered skull fractures and traumatic brain injuries. Months of treatment in a hospital. Continues to suffer from cognitive problems, including memory loss and difficulty distinguishing reality from fantasy. He now has the mental capacity of a 14-year-old child. DuBose, who has 7 prior serious convictions. Just ponder that for a second. Already he's got 7 prior serious convictions. pleaded guilty in March to a felony charge of battery causing serious injury and a misdemeanor charge of assault with force likely to produce great bodily injury. But at his sentencing hearing, Orange County Superior Court Judge Roger B. Robbins reduced the felony assault charge to a misdemeanor. He's already pled guilty to the felony charge, but the judge lowers it from a felony to a misdemeanor offense, dismissed an enhancement of causing great bodily injury to the victim, and struck the 7 prior strike convictions over the objections of the prosecution. According to KTLA, the reason for the leniency was not clear. KTLA says DeBoe's extensive criminal history includes a gang-related takeover robbery at a business in which one victim was pistol-whipped, another man was held at knife point. The victim's father, Philip Coley, implored the judge to give DeBoe a lengthy prison sentence. Statement by the family said Coley told the judge of being by his son's hospital bed for 2.5 months, watching him fight for his life, and the life sentence that his family has been forced to endure watching and caring for their now incapacitated son. Philip Coley said, "I feel like it's unjust. It's unfair. This is an ex-felon whose behavior has not changed. He is a clear and evident threat to society. He should be sentenced as such." The prosecutor, Todd Spitzer, agreed, saying that it is, quote, unconscionable that someone who intentionally unleashed this level of violence after a lifetime of committing crime would be given such a lenient sentence. This slap on the wrist does little to hold the perpetrator accountable or protect our community from someone who has demonstrated an increasingly serious level of violence. And the DA there in Orange County is absolutely correct about that. I hope at some point we learn why the judge decided the decision that he did. But again, you want to reduce violent crime? Let's actually ensure that the law is being enforced rather than seeing a violent career criminal come into court, have his already agreed to felony plea reduced down to a misdemeanor, given that slap on the wrist, and sent on his way. We've got an armed citizen story for you today out of New Mexico, Espanola, New Mexico. First fatal shooting of the year there in Espanola, and it's a self-defense shooting. This sounds like a weird deal, by the way. Daryl Padilla, transported to the hospital after trying to break into a home. This was on August the 8th. According to the police department, the incident first reported to 911 dispatchers about 3:45 in the morning on August the 8th. There was a woman who lives in an apartment, said that these 2 guys were trying to get into the domicile there, pounding the door, kicking the door, and they were identifying themselves as law enforcement. They were actually claiming that they were from the FBI High-Intensity Drug Task Force Region 3. Dispatch logs state that the woman said she doesn't think they're cops. They were not. They, again, identified themselves that way to the victim. According to the Espanola Police Department Public Information Officer, Sergeant Jeremy Apodaca, he said that Daryl Padilla was armed with a black pellet gun. He had taped a laser pointer to the end of that pellet gun with a clear intent of ensuring that the individuals inside that apartment believed that that was a real firearm. Well, they did. A gentleman named Alex Lucero, who lives at the apartment, was armed legally, and he tried to stop Padilla from coming inside. Apodaca says Padilla kicked the door open. That's when the tenant saw the barrel of the gun come through the door. The tenant announced several times that he was armed, and that's when the offender went into the living room, just stepping through the doorway. And being that he was armed, the tenant protected himself with his own weapon. After shooting the intruder, Lucero actually tried to stop Padilla's bleeding using a makeshift tourniquet. Padilla told officers that there had been another man with him, but Apodaca was not sure whether or not he was able to give the name of that individual to officers before he was transported to the hospital. Meanwhile, the attendant there, Alex Lucero, is not expected to face any charges. Sergeant Apodaca says you do have the right to protect yourself and your family. And being that the person was armed, Lucero pretty much took the appropriate actions, from my understanding. He said he announced that he was armed. He announced not to come in his house, and Padilla still came in with a weapon. It is a sad situation that Padilla put himself in, but I'm glad that the tenants there were able to protect themselves from that armed intruder. Now on to our good deed of the day. Good deed involving a police lieutenant in Houston, Texas, a man in need, and his duck. Yes, his duck. According to KHOU in Houston, Texas, Harris County Precinct 4 officer ended up lending a helping hand to a man and his duck. Lieutenant Beck responded to a call of a suspicious vehicle in the Home Depot parking lot on North Freeway. Man in the car told Lieutenant Beck that he was going through a hard time, needed some help, needed some money and needed some food for both him and his duck. Well, Lieutenant Beck stepped in, went above and beyond the call of duty, gave the man and his duck some water, some fruit, and some snacks. And hopefully this gentleman and his duck have much better days ahead. But in the right place, at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. Lieutenant Beck there in Harris County, we thank you for your good deeds, sir. That is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. Good news is we're on iTunes now. Yay! So if you like the podcast, you can subscribe there. Stitcher, Spotify, of course, townhall.com podcast. You can find us as well. If you like the video version of the program, then, of course, subscribe to Town Hall Media on YouTube. Thank you so much again for watching, for spreading the word. Have a very good weekend. We'll be back Monday morning. Well, not Monday morning. We'll be back Monday at some point with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. We'll see you then.